Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? Your hosts are Steve Becker and me, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us at our website, horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, this is a trigger warning. It's a horror podcast. We're going to be talking about horror things, so it's not guaranteed, but we could delve into sensitive subjects such as violence, murder, rape, child abuse, but that's not to say that that is a definite thing, once again. It's more of just a fun psychological delve into what it is people like about horror. With that said, Steve, what do we got
coming up?
I hesitated asking the question because I'm like, I know the answer is nothing.
Yes. Well, I mean, we still do it. I guess the news is that we are now doing 3 weekly events on Discord. So we've got the Listen Party, Drawing Party, and Watch Party. For the Listen Party, we stream episodes of the podcast, hang out and chat about it while we're streaming it. Chris's Drawing Party, he has a horror-themed webcomic called Pieces, which you can find at piecesoflesh.com. And so he live streams himself working on the webcomic. And then we've also got watch parties on Saturdays where we stream movies.
Watch movies.
Yeah. So we have a link to our Discord server on our website. Again, horrormakesushappy.com. So if you want to join us, just go there and grab the link. But today we are talking to Mr. Daniel Kraus, author, best known for his works Whalefall, The Living Dead in the Shape of Water. Welcome, Daniel. How are you?
Good. You know, there was a Whalefall beer, which we should have just called Alefall.
Yeah, right. So before we get into the meat of the interview, do you want to let people know what you're currently working on?
Sure. A lot of things. I've got a book. The next book coming out, depending on when this podcast comes out, is September 3rd of 2024. So that's Pay the Piper, my second and final novel with George Romero. And then next year is a book called Angel Down. That's about some World War I soldiers that shoot down an angel. And then the year after that is The Sixth Nick, which is my first science fiction book, but it is also the most horrifying book I've ever written in a lot of ways. And then there's some books after that, but I think that's far enough.
You're right. So it's been a little while since we talked about having you on the show. I don't know if you remember the information that we shared, but basically the theme of the interview is that we'll talk about your love of horror as a genre from childhood through adulthood. And then at the end, we'll talk about any common themes that crop up multiple times and how those themes might intersect with horror as a genre. That said, it's not meant to be a therapy session. So if there's any questions we ask that you don't want to answer, you just say pass and move on.
Sure.
But starting with childhood, what are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
Well, I mean, it all goes back to being about 5. And two things happened. Well, 2 pieces of media happened, really. One was Night of the Living Dead, which my mom, for some reason, invited me to watch with her. It was probably just on, because it was always on. And she just liked it. And I would watch it with her. And then, a few months later, it'd be on again, and we'd watch it. And I think her interest in it and excitement about it and the way she was able to have fun with it and laugh at it, she'd laugh at Barbara, who's tripping all over the place or whatever, kind of made Night of the Living Dead a safe space. It wasn't until I was older, really, that it began to scare me more, And then the second was Twilight Zone. She was a Twilight Zone fan from childhood, and that she started inviting me to watch. Where we lived, it played every Friday night, so she'd invite me on Friday nights to watch Twilight Zone with her. Or I invited myself, and she just let me do it.
One of the two.
Yeah, and that's the key with sort of these early childhood parental experiences, is that there has to be sort of a permission given a lot of times. And my dad was the opposite. Like, well into my teens, he would have us shutting off movies and not being able to rent certain movies and all that kind of stuff. But my mom was the opposite. She was, at least with me, she was very welcoming to that kind of stuff. So I really, really grew up on Twilight Zone, Night of the Living Dead. And it was the first genre that made me excited. And it was, as I said, sort of a safe space, instead of, I think I was introduced to it in a safe way, whereas most people are introduced to horror in kind of obviously a scary way.
Yeah.
So very early, it became a refuge. And it's funny that we're doing this interview today because for the last 2 or 3 days, I've been going through, for the first time ever, going through the diary that I kept from 1987 to 1990. So I would have been in 6th, 7th, 8th grade. It's kind of in there. And it's one of those 5-year diaries. So there's very little room. You got just like two.
It's jam-packed.
It's just jam-packed, but it's like there's no room for like any personality really to come through. Like it's just like every day is just kind of a list of factual things that happened that day. I watched this, got a B- in this test, blah, 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 just like that. But it's more than anything in this diary, it's a record of movies I watched. And it's all horror. And it's really fascinating. I mean, I was aware of this anyway, but to see it on a day-by-day basis going through these old diaries, you see how obsessed I was with horror in general, but more specifically individual movies that I just watched over and over and over. Like, I'm shocked. Some of them, of course, I remember. Like, I remember a period where I was watching The Lost Boys every day. And I've seen that. I've come across those diary entries. But then there's other ones where I just don't remember being so obsessed. But House and House 2, they pop up constantly. I'm always watching the House movies.
They were fun.
Yeah, Halloween 2 for some reason. I mean, these are, a lot of these things were just things that were popping up on TV, I guess.
That's exactly what I was going to say, yeah.
So, yeah, bizarre choices over and over. Creepshow and Creepshow 2 are both really big in these diaries. And there's a lot of angst about, I tried to record Creepshow last night and it didn't work, or the recording got screwed up. There's a lot of anxiety over, this movie's going to be on HBO in 4 days and I've got to try to record it. And it's amazing how much real estate that takes up in the diary.
The trouble is kids these days with their Netflixes and Amazons will never know.
No, they won't. I mean, it's like, it was a real cause of concern.
Oh, yeah. I think not so much for the movies for me. I mainly recorded like songs on the radio, but
yeah.
My mom was in charge of recording the movies. And yeah, we had like multiple drawers filled with those classic like Maxell tapes with the label on them.
Oh, yeah.
When you said your mom was she welcoming you to watch like all kinds of movies with her, or was it mainly horror because she was mainly watching horror?
There's a lot of record that I don't remember so much in these diaries about just random movies that she would watch, and I would watch them. Like Murphy's Romance, which was an old Sally Field movie, for example. So yeah, I like, I just like movies, clearly. I think of my family, I had 2 sisters. I was just the movie fan. But clearly the other genres aren't a passion. Like when it's my choice to rent something or to record something, it was always horror. And what really sticks out to me, even before I went through these diaries, was this constant push and pull of being really scared of some of these movies and then coming to embrace them later. Like, there's a thread through some of the diary entries where I was really scared of Poltergeist 3 for some reason. Like, even before I saw it, I think I remember seeing a trailer for it, maybe in a movie theater, and being really scared by it.
3 was the one with the high rise and the reflections in the water, right?
Yeah. A lot of mirror imagery. But then, you fast forward down the page 3 years of the diary, and, I'm watching it. I've embraced it. I'm watching it on purpose. I'm renting it. And, there's many cases in the diary, but I didn't need the diary for this because I remember that, of getting physically sick from watching horror films. And they weren't films that today you would think would scare you, and they're not very scary movies. I remember movies like Deadly Friend. It's a ridiculous movie. And
yeah, it was.
The Stuff, which is really more of a comedy. And of course, Poltergeist 3. I remember Halloween 3. Like, these are movies I remember being, practically throwing up watching. Like just being so afraid that I would be in a impaired state. But I was, from a very young age, I was very, very interested in my fear response. I mean, I wouldn't have phrased it like that. But looking back, I always dip back into the things that scare me. Like I couldn't resist revisiting the things that made me the most scared.
So a lot of our guests have reported sort of a dividing line where prior to this dividing line, horror just scared them. And then after the dividing line, horror then started to become entertainment or fun. Was there...
Sounds like for you, it was kind of like simultaneous, really.
It was, although it's a little messier for me, but there was, I sort of have an answer. Although, again, it wasn't a firm line, but it did start to bend one way after Nightmare on Elm Street 3 came out. Okay. And okay. I know that particular movie is a big one for kids of my era. And there was something about that movie, as opposed to the first, certainly the original Nightmare on Elm Street, that did have a sense of fun to it, along with being scary. I think the group of young warriors was just kind of exciting. And I really, really got into Freddy Krueger. And I started drawing him in art class, and I created these things that were, I guess I could just call them Freddy comics. And they were almost like, and The Simpsons hadn't come out yet, but they were almost like The Simpsons, except it was with Freddy and Freddy's wife and Freddy's two kids.
The Freddy family.
Yeah, it was a Freddy family. And the main character was Freddy's son, Pee-wee. I knew I wrote a lot of them, but it wasn't until just today, looking through these old diaries, that, at least so far in the diary, I've created over 350 of them. Like, I just kept making them. So just clearly I was obsessed, and that's when I started buying Fangoria. But that period of when I was buying Fangoria didn't last very long either, because as I was saying, there was sort of a push and pull. I started getting really scared by some of the things in Fangoria. So even though I was buying them for the Freddy content, there was other stuff in there that really bothered me. And it all kind of came to a head on this one occasion where I had purchased the latest Fangoria, which wasn't really a magazine. It was a poster. It looked like a magazine, but it was just filled with like 12 posters. And I went over, stayed overnight at a friend's. I brought this book, and we had put up all the posters, and they were so scary. And we were supposed to sleep in the room with all these horrifying posters. And there were some really gory ones. Like there was one from Day of the Dead, I remember, and particularly one from The Evil Dead, which was a close-up of the guy's eyes getting gouged out.
Nice.
And I got so anxious that I had to call my mom to pick me up. The sort of classic, you call your mom to pick you up from a sleepover. But I remember thinking I was too old for that, but I had done it anyway. I was so ashamed and really disappointed in myself. And that's a kind of thread that bounces through my horror history too. This kind of, in one way, you can read my youthful experiences with horror as really positive. Like, you reading these diaries, you can see how my daily experiences going to school, particularly in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, classically, were really difficult. There was a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear. But then I would go home and watch these horror movies, which kind of made me feel tough. So in a way, they were armor. I was sort of building up kind of my own toughness in a way. But sometimes it went too far, or I would have relapses, like I was describing with the sleepover. And so it was constantly fighting between feeling like horror was making me tougher and feeling like horror was beating me down in a way, and just exposing me for the coward that I was.
So what scared you about Poltergeist 3?
Well, that initial trailer, I think, was the big thing. And if I remember right, the trailer showed almost nothing. It was just this kind of aerial shot. I'm sure you can find it on YouTube, of the high rise. It was the same thing with, as I mentioned, Deadly Friend or The Stuff. It's there was never really any good sense behind it. like these aren't particularly scary movies. Like there was no telling really what tripped the trigger on me. And I think that's what was so made watching horror such a crapshoot for me, and such a scary / exciting one, is I never knew what was going to set me off. There'd just be some spark that was lit, and then I wouldn't be able to douse it for some reason. And it was almost like a panic attack.
Well, instead of talking about the trigger, then let's talk about the response. What was your response to Poltergeist?
It was to get physically sick. Yeah, it was to get nauseated very quickly. To a certain degree, that response exists today. It's not used in response to horror movies anymore. But this feeling that there can be something upsetting, and 90% of the time, I can just beat it down. It's like, well, there's nothing that upsetting here. Let's move on. But every once in a while, the spark just catches something. And it doesn't matter how silly the spark was. I don't really know, but it feels like this is a classic panic attack response, where the inciting incident is really not that relevant. It's just sort of your inability to stop your brain and your physical body from running away with it. But it does create neural pathways where suddenly now you're really scared of Poltergeist 3. You know, like maybe you had this weird experience seeing the trailer in a theater and it almost made you sick. And now Poltergeist 3 is just terrifying to you for no good reason at all. Has nothing to do with what's in the movie. And I would learn that when I would finally not be able to resist and would rent Poltergeist 3 and watch it and end up having a good time. So it was all very confusing. And I think that's one of the scariest things about horror. It's just the confusion of it. Like having this reaction was like being in a horror film. It just wasn't any sense to it, and it felt like I was completely unprotected.
So are you saying that watching the movie actually didn't bother you, or are you saying that watching it again later didn't bother you?
I think later. I think a movie like that I would have avoided for a long time. Mm-hmm. And so by the time I watched it, a couple of years might have passed. So I might have been in a slightly different place. And I might watch some really intense horror movies, but because of the situation in which I watched them, with the right person or at the right time, they didn't have any effect on me. But there were other situations at other times with much less scary films that did sort of set me off. So there was no real rhyme or reason for it, which really felt like, in retrospect, when I look at it, feels like almost like being in a slasher film. You just can't. You don't know where it's going to pop up next, where this bad reaction is going to pop up.
Any idea what was triggering the panic?
Yeah, I mean, with many years of hindsight, generally I think it was some sort of inability to escape the situation. For example, like if you're watching a horror movie at a sleepover with a few friends, you can't just turn off the movie. You can't leave the room. You know what I mean? Like you're sort of trapped. I think it was the feeling of being trapped that often set it off. Now, not always. There were a few times where I was just alone watching TV at home, and I could have turned the channel and instead just got so terrified I had to run up to the bathroom and like dry heave for a while. Mm-hmm. So there is no hard and fast rule here, but I do know that the sense of there being no out was a much more likely trigger.
Okay.
Yeah, no escape is a fairly visceral fear.
Yeah.
Did you participate in Halloween as a kid?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I loved Halloween. You know, I trick-or-treated. Those last few years, you really go out with a friend, or you're more intent on scaring littler kids. Mm-hmm. You know, I lived I guess I should clarify this, but I lived in a very small town in Iowa. So it was a pretty rural experience. But I did love Halloween because generally for a kid, the Halloween experience is a fun one. It's like dressing up, getting candy, and you know, those aren't really scary things.
Yeah. Did you have a favorite costume or a least favorite costume?
I really don't remember many costumes. I mostly remember, and I'm sure kids are still going through this today, always being frustrated about having to ruin the costume because it was cold. You know, like you'd have to wear a coat over it, or just something that really ruined the vibe of the costume. I remember just being always frustrated by that. But no, the dressing up was never a huge deal for me. I mean, I enjoyed it, but it's not something where I would plan out for months what I was going to be.
More of a means of an ends to the candy.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Did you have any reoccurring dreams or nightmares when you were a kid?
Well, my very first dream that I ever remember, which may be my very first memory, is a scary dream. So I would have been, at the oldest, I would have been 4, but I could have been 3. Wow. Because I know that because it was at a different house where I had this dream. And I moved like just after I turned 4. So I was very young. So it might be my first memory. And one night I had a dream. It's still extremely vivid to me in ways that actual things that happened at that age is all gone. And in this dream, it's very, very short. I'm in the dream. I'm 3 years old. I've got my pajamas on. I'm walking back to my bedroom at night through the dark house from the bathroom. And I look over. I hear a baby crying. And I look over because I had a baby sister at the time. And I see my baby sister in a crib. And there are 2 arms coming out of the ceiling toward the baby, which is pretty scary. But then there's one more detail which pushes it into absurdity, but to me still feels scary. Both hands have bottles of lotion in them, and they're squeezing the lotion, and it's piling up all over the baby. And that's the entirety of the dream. And it was so scary that the very next night, I had a dream that there were TV screens all over my bedroom playing that previous night's dream. And then I couldn't escape it.
That is an interesting one. That that is one I have not heard before.
No, it's weird.
Yeah.
Let's see. Was there ever a time in your childhood when you were terrified of something in real life?
Probably constantly. I was always afraid of, or had a very, again, a sort of nauseated reaction to real life blood. And I'm much better about it today. So yeah, the blood spilled injury was always scary. There were just certain times in those terrible years where bullies really were the main fear. Right. When you're the youngest grade in middle school or the youngest grade in high school. And I was until I had a massive growth spurt in high school. But until then, I was the littlest boy in my class. I was very, very short, very skinny.
So you were the Millhouse.
Yeah, exactly. So that made me a target to some degree. And I was decently good at blending in and not drawing attention to myself, and not always, particularly spaces where there was no adult policing going on. And that could be in the bathrooms or the locker rooms, or in my case, there was an industrial arts class in middle school. That was, shop class, which had a big space because there were a lot of machinery in there and stuff. And I remember, and this bears out in the diary, so much anxiety about shop class because the teacher just was sort of non-present, and I just had a bad draw of students in that class, and we'd be back there among the machines where nobody could see us. And to this day, I'm mad at that teacher. Like, where were you? When all these horrible things were happening.
Yeah, that's not a good combination.
Yeah, mostly interpersonal stuff like that was the major fear.
Flipping that last question around, was there ever a time in your childhood when you felt exceptionally calm or safe or bliss?
I mean, my gut answer is no. I don't think I had a particularly terrible childhood or anything, but feeling safe and peaceful is not really a memory that I feel. And I think going back to these diaries was a real chance for that to be debunked. I could have read these diaries and been really surprised by, oh, look, I was actually kind of happy these days and was having fun. But that's not the case. Like, every day seems to be, I saw this, I played this, but also interspersed within those terse facts will be, I'm so worried about this and I'm sick about this. And so I feel like I was just maybe an anxious kid, and I don't know exactly why.
Okay. So the next 2 questions are also going to be a pair. We'll, again, start with the negative so we can end on the positive. Do you remember the first person you hurt?
Boy, I wish I did. I mean, those are the kind of things I feel like if I did, I would be a better person, I remember, I kind of remember friends who lived near me and being mean to them, like not wanting, like sort of like not choosing to not hang out with them, giving them a cold shoulder. And it's surprising in these diaries how much brain space is given to, is this group in the science class going to let me be in their group? Or at this school baseball game, am I going to be able to sit with so-and-so and so? So, I mean, that stuff is a big deal back in those days. So I can remember mostly being on the bad end of that, but I can also remember blocking people out. Not very often, to my own credit, but I can think of once or twice that I did.
Okay. Flipping that question around, do you remember the first person you helped?
Helped. See, this is where I have the biggest regrets. You know, I think about, again, particularly in middle school, when I might have been the smallest, but I wasn't the ones who were the most hounded. There were kids who just were more overtly unusual, and they were the ones who got bullied the most. And I can think of a couple times with this one other kid who was almost as small as me, but he was just weirder than me. He was just like, there was something more unusual about him, which is not a good thing at that age. Right. And I can remember a couple times where, like, I'll give you one example where they're all eating at lunch, you know, all the 7th grade boys or whatever. And this kid sat at our table, and one by one, everyone got up and left the table until I was the only one left. Because I just, you know, to my own credit, I just couldn't bear to do it. But I also was no hero. So I stayed there the longest, still just me and him. But then probably before I was really done with my food, I got up and went outside. Like he went. So I didn't change tables, but I left and went outside to lunch recess. And so I think there were a few times where I could have stood up for that kid, or I could have just been friendlier to him. Like, it's so easy to say, but like back in the time, you're going to get punished for that, particularly if you're someone like me. Like, there's going to be social consequences to that. So I try to be a little sympathetic with myself, but mostly I'm disappointed.
Okay. It's not completely uncommon. You never know until you ask. There are people that we've talked to that have memories easily come to them. Other people don't, and also in your case, sometimes you ask a question and it triggers the opposite response, and you go, actually, there's the opposite is what I remember. Mm-hmm. Not uncommon. Yeah. Just you never know what you're going to get until you ask. So
yeah.
All right. So moving into the teenage years, do you remember any particular media that stood out to you as important during the teenage years? I know we talked a bit about the diary here for the childhood section, but I wasn't really clear on what the difference.
Right. Were. So I'd kind of separate it into the diary gets me through 9th grade or so. Once I'm in the teenage years, definitely coming into my own more, and also just expanding more beyond horror. Just that's when the video stores have been around now for a while. I get my first job as a teenager, which is at the local movie theater, which also rented movies. So suddenly I had all these movies around me that I could rent for free. So I was just watching everything and just working my way through anything that struck my fancy, whether that was Eraserhead or Apocalypse Now, or just, I'm just expanding sort of intellectually. But horror I never left it behind. It was still something I enjoyed, but I'm trying to think if there's anything of that era in horror that was important to me. This might have been when Night of the Living Dead really came back to me. Like, it's always been the most important piece of media in my life. And I know in these years, I had a series of VHS copies of it. But I know I bought it 2 or 3 different times just in high school. So the fact that I'm spending my non-existent money on VHS tapes of Night of the Living Dead show that I think it did make a comeback. And I think part of it was I was seeing new facets in it that I hadn't as a child, and I was appreciating it on other levels, which I still am today. Like, it's a movie that it's really the only movie in my life that I can watch over and over. I'm not really a repeat in my adulthood. I'm not really a repeat consumer of art. Most movies I watch only once. Books I read once.
I'm the same way.
Yeah. And I feel like most people seemed to be the other way. And as a kid, I was certainly the other way. But the one exception is Night of the Dead, which is just continue to find, I don't know.
I think it depends a lot on circumstance. We've talked to people who have answered both ways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you had mentioned earlier in life, Night of the Living Dead was more of a safe space with your mom. And you did mention that when it came back around, you were sort of introduced to it in a different way. Do you want to talk about how you approached it or what it meant to you in your teen years?
The film itself started to feel more serious to me, whereas before it was, as a kid, it felt kind of campy, and that was helped along by my mom, who would laugh at it. And that's one of the magic tricks of Night, is it can be all these things. You can watch it today, and you can watch the riff tracks version, which makes perfect sense when you watch it. It's funny and campy, but it can also be watched and taken deadly serious. And really, the end of it never failed to put kind of a hush around people, if there are more than me just watching it, or just me. Like, no matter how much fun you're having when Ben gets shot at the end, it's just, to this day, it's rare to have a movie where a hero of that caliber is so offhandedly killed. And that's the key. It's like, we've seen heroes die sort of heroically at the end.
Right. It has meaning to it. This was it was an accident. Basically.
Yeah. Like, and it's worse than an accident.
Yeah.
Because an accident would just be they shot at a zombie and hit Ben instead. What this is that they didn't...
Ignorance.
Yeah, they didn't think he was worth checking out to see if he was dead or not. Like, it'd be like having Lord of the Rings, and in the last scene, Aragorn gets run over by a horse, like something just completely casual like that. So that made it had and continues to have a big impact on me. And I think, and at that point I was writing novel length books too in my free time. And I think what really began to affect my art pretty early is how Night of the Living Dead doesn't hew to typical good guy, bad guy, black and white lines. Like, Ben is the hero, but he makes some really bad decisions. Harry Cooper, the sensible villain of the movie, makes a couple really smart decisions and observations. And Romero's ability to sort of put wisdom sometimes into the mouths of his bad guys and have his good guys do awful things occasionally really was affecting to me. It really got my head moving in a direction that when I started writing books of my own, I was always very intrigued by that. Jumbling or graying out divisions between antagonists and protagonists.
You mentioned Eraserhead. I think that kind of is, say, horror adjacent.
It's horror. I mean, it's weird. That's for sure.
Depends on the eyes of the beholder, which is why I figured I'd let him talk about it.
Well, I mean, Eraserhead wasn't a movie I watched a bunch or anything, but at some point in high school, I rented it, and
you remembered it enough to mention it.
Yeah, well, it's hard. It's kind of unforgettable. It's not a movie you watch and then forget. Like, even if you don't like it, it's just like, what the fuck is this? Like, if you're a kid in the middle of nowhere in Iowa, like, you just never see anything like this.
Right.
And I watched it in the full light of day on the TV in my busy living room. I remember, like, probably 2 p.m. on a Sunday or something. People were just walking around. The very unideal way to watch such a film. And still, I was riveted by, like, just the lack of linear sense to it. It was fascinating. And I at least rented it 1 or 2 more times under better circumstances. And certainly when I got to college, I mean, college is made for movies like that. You're actually sitting up with people and trying to analyze it. But yeah, the most powerful viewing of it was that Sunday afternoon viewing, where I just so caught off guard by what it was, or maybe more importantly, what it wasn't.
The other thing that you brought up in those first 3 movies was, I think it was Apocalypse Now?
Yeah, and again, it's not a movie I have a heavy emotional memory of. It's just sort of an example of trying to stretch beyond, changing from someone who wanted to watch Lost Boys or Young Guns for the 50th time to someone who wanted to be challenged. Because I would go to work and I'd be working until the last movie ended. And so I'd come home with a a movie rental from the theater, and I'd watch it. And because I was getting these movies for free now, and so often, the preciousness of having to rent something that you thought you were going to like that was worth the money was lifted. I could take a risk on anything. And so that's when I really started watching, whether it's Apocalypse Now or Taxi Driver or The Godfather or whatever. It's just you're just starting to watch things that expand your horizons.
Did you feel that Apocalypse Now expanded your horizons?
I'm sure it did broaden my horizons, but not in any specific way that I can pinpoint, because I didn't become obsessed with it. It was more of a piece of a broader puzzle, of just trying to watch things that felt like they were adult movies. I'm trying to move out of space that felt like they were movies for teens, really.
Okay. Any scary dreams or reoccurring nightmares as a teen?
No, I can't think of any.
Okay. Was there ever a time in your teens when you were terrified of something in real life?
No, nothing different than I think I've said earlier. I don't recall any kind of radical shift in life that would have created a new kind of thing to be concerned about.
Okay. Was there a time in your teens when you felt exceptionally calm or safe or bliss?
Yeah, I think so. I feel like, as I mentioned before, my junior and senior years of high school, I had established some sort of stasis where I felt like I had a sort of group of friends, and I'd gone from being a tiny kid whose main goal was to not get noticed to a kind of normal-sized kid who suddenly was like the president of everything. Like I totally sort of reworked who I was and became super outgoing. Was in every group imaginable and president of most of them. I remember at some point I was president of some group that I never even went to. I was just like de facto president. I just kind of became an overachiever, I guess, is one way to put
it. Before jumping into adult years, I want to just circle back again and double check. Were there any other media that jumped out to you from your teen years that you wanted to talk about? If not, that's fine. I just thought I'd give you a shot.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. All right, I'll roll into adult years then. And I understand this is potentially a larger portion of your life, but if you were to pick maybe the top 2 or 3 things that jump out to you.
Well, I guess in my adult years is when I really, in a much more sophisticated way, started getting into George Romero. Like I had seen as many Romero movies as I could as a teenager in high school and college, but it was limited. You were still limited to what the video stores around you had. So I'd probably seen Night, Day, Dawn, and Creepshow, and pretty much everything else was unavailable.
Return.
So, which Return wasn't Romero though.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Return was definitely out there. So yeah, I started really sort of studying his works as soon as I could get a hold of them. And that became a kind of a lifelong pursuit that ended, of course, with me picking up 2 of his unfinished projects and finishing them to actually collaborate with him on a couple novels, which is obviously a dream come true.
Yeah.
Beyond that, I'm trying to think of other things that were major. There was a point I mostly did in my 20s. I mostly did film stuff. I worked in documentaries. And had kind of gotten away from the novel and story writing that I had been doing my entire young life after that point. But at some point, I got a part-time job at a bookstore. This would have been, I don't know how old I would have been, maybe something like 28 or something. And I hadn't realized it because I was still reading all the time. I didn't realize that I had really lost my love for it. I think in college, I got sort of distracted into reading books that I thought I should want to read rather than books that I really did want to read.
Yeah.
And working at this bookstore sort of fixed that. Like they had this, all these old books, like old used books with those great like retro covers. And there were 3 books that so I would just, while I was pacing around the bookstore, I would occasionally buy one of these cover books that I've been staring at all day. And I read 3 in a row that really changed my life, really. and I don't know that I would list two of them. I definitely wouldn't even. Well, no, I'm trying to figure out if they were my favorite books of all time. But they were just there were three really good books that got me thinking about writing again. And those books were Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and Matheson's I Am Legend. And Martian Chronicles and Invisible Man remain favorites to this day. I don't think I ever went back and reread I Am Legend again. But all three of them I just loved. They just got me really excited about fiction again. After reading those books, the direction of what I wanted to do changed. And I thought, I should try writing a novel. So I did try to write it, and then they got published by Random House. And then the rest is history.
What do you like about Martian Chronicles?
I'm always jealous when I hear people say that they read Bradbury in middle school or high school that we certainly never got to. So I was completely, I knew his name, of course. I'd watched Ray Bradbury theater a lot, but I just never read him before. And I wasn't really a sci-fi guy. I didn't think I was. Of course, the way Bradbury writes sci-fi is not, it's like sci-fi for people who don't want hard sci-fi. And today I do love hard sci-fi, but at the time I didn't. It's, Bradbury writes the lightest of sci-fi. And I was just bowled over by it in a lot of ways, and I don't think I realized this till just this second. The Martian, there's a similarity between the Martian Chronicles and Night of the Living Dead in that they have no similarities of genre trappings, but they both are highly watchable / readable and are really deep, to use a real insufficient word. Like, they're so heavy with metaphor. And once you kind of lock into those metaphors, for me anyway, I really got excited by them. That you could write a movie about zombies and it really be about, the various strata of society. Or you could write a book about Martians and it be about, everything that's going on in America during that time. Like it just, the capabilities of fiction just suddenly became very, very clear to me in a way that was exciting.
Okay. What about Invisible Man?
Invisible Man was really all about the prose for me. Like, I just got really excited by the writing. It was so dense in its own way and acrobatic, and just was the right book for me at the right time. Again, at that time, I was reading a lot of the quote unquote modern classics, your Richard Ford books or your Tim O'Brien books, which I, basically enjoyed, but didn't kind of blow my head up like Invisible Man did. Where part of what was exciting about reading these three books that I mentioned was that they were old. But to find such great books that spoke to me that were so old was like having that first video store open in my hometown. It was like, oh, there's this depth of stuff out there that I haven't even begun to touch. I'm at the very tip of an iceberg here. And that was just so exciting to know that. In some ways, it's exciting to know that you know nothing. And that's what happened.
Between you getting a job at the video store and that expanding your horizons on video, and then getting a job at a bookstore and that expanding your horizons in the literary sense, I can't help but wonder what your next job is going to be.
Well, I was at that point when I was at the bookstore, I was making my living freelance writing. So I was writing for magazines and stuff. But this was just post 9/11.
I was more making a joke of it being some third job that exposes you to additional horizons that you had not explored before.
Well, to answer the joke question, you would think that maybe next I would work at like a video game store or something and realize all the video games I had missed out on. But no, that was sort of those two jobs were really the two that kind of changed me artistically.
So both of the descriptions that you gave for those, it would fall under what we have experienced with other guests in terms of when we interview people who are creators in the business. There's sort of, it's what your head is attracted to and what your heart is attracted to. And the more cerebral stuff is, loving something as an auteur. And that's how I would kind of describe your description of the Martian Chronicles and Invisible Man. Is it was awakening the auteur side of things, which is understandable and appreciable, but for what we're trying to drive at for our podcast deals more with the heart, if we can use that analogy. Did you have an emotional reaction to either of those books, or was it all cerebral?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think particularly Martian Chronicles. That was the one where, like, there are stories in there to make you cry. Bradbury is really, he's kind of two things. He's a metaphor machine, and he's a very emotional writer. And so many of his most famous books and short stories are about childhood, like obviously his Dandelion Wine, his Greentown stories. They're all kind of colored with this wistfulness for his childhood, which, even if you're only 30 that's old enough. I mean, you feel some of that yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Your life has gotten complicated enough that you remember when things were simpler, even if life was filled with anxiety, as my childhood had been. Still, there was still it was simpler. You sort of knew the rules. So I think at that point in your late 20s, it's not young adulthood, but you're still trying to figure out what you want to do with your life. And so there's this, I think, natural nostalgia for youth. And Bradbury plumbed so heavily into that, even if he's writing about aliens, that, it was very emotional. That's why I just started devouring Bradbury books. It really wasn't the ideas as much as the emotion.
Okay. What about Invisible Man?
And Invisible Man, of course, was, if I'm recalling correctly, we're talking about urban Black people trying to carve off their parts of the American dream. Like, that's couldn't be more different than my upbringing. So there was very little recognition of, this is like me. Nothing about it was like me, but it was less emotional and more just, this is what another portion of the world, another portion of history was experiencing. This is what really, really good writing can be. It almost was something that was aspirational in a way, like not what's happening in the story, but just how the story was being told.
Okay. What about I Am Legend?
What was so great about I Am Legend was almost the opposite of Invisible Man. Like, it was just such a perfectly fine-tuned commercial product. And I think that's why these three books in conjunction were such a powerful trio. You had Invisible Man, which is high art, Martian Chronicles, which is high emotion that I could really plug into. And then you have I Am Legend, which is high commerciality, but didn't put me off like a lot of other, modern movies and books that just felt like cheesy. Like, there was something, it was classic Matheson in a way. It was like there was, he wrote so many Twilight Zones, which were so important to me. And then Hugh Hero was finally reading a book that he had written, and it felt of that kind. Like, it just, this is a person who knows how to do this in a way that, for the first time, I began to wonder, I can see a way to work in a space that's commercial enough that maybe you could actually make a living doing it while still having the emotion and sort of high prose of these other things. Because, one thing that remained very confusing to me at the time was how anyone got into publishing. What the hell even do you do? But at least on the sort of craft level, it suddenly seemed these were inspirational texts.
Again, pair of questions, starting with the negative so we can end on the positive. Do you remember the last person you hurt?
Yes, I do. And I'm just going to leave it at that because these things are just too fresh.
Understood. So again, the flipping that one around, do you remember the last person you helped?
Yeah, I think, one of really the only joy for me of social media is helping people. And there's nothing more I like than somehow lifting up someone who's doing something artistically that hasn't been noticed by anyone else. And I'm in a position where my opinion can mean something to someone. So if I can, what most often happens is I'll read something, and ideally, it'll be something that is completely off the map, from some tiny publisher or something. And to be able to read that and feel like, not that I've discovered necessarily, but then can elevate it,
right,
and make that writer's day and bring more eyes to it. Like, that just gives me a ton of satisfaction. I love that. That's just the highlight of my days. So I do that, and I feel like I do that a lot, and I've done it pretty recently. It's just, there's a limited ways I can use my whatever my cachet is right now. Right. It's arguable that it's that great, but it's whatever it is. It's one good way I can use it. One way that's, I think it's just a win-win for everyone.
Right. Yeah, we don't have a lot of cachet exactly ourselves either, but one of the things that I have greatly appreciated, we're in our 5th year now, and one of the things that I've always enjoyed is continuing to be interactive on social media and seeing all the cool things that our former guests are now doing, and being able to share and repost and retweet and all that kind of fun stuff. It's nice being able to engage in that uplifting of each other, as you say.
Exactly.
I like Jack Amos's dad jokes.
There's also that.
Let's see. So the next 2 questions are going to cover your entire life, and not just relate to horror. Could be any genre. I think we may have answered one of these already. What movie would you say you've watched more times than any other?
Well, you know what that is. Night of the Living Dead, I've probably seen 300 times, and like the next closest is probably 20 times. It's far and away the movie that I've watched more than any other.
And normally we start with that question and then ask, what is your favorite movie? Because sometimes they're different, but in this case, I would say it's probably the same for this.
It's the same, yeah.
Okay. Well, normally this would be where we talk about common themes that have been cropping up throughout the call, and then maybe spend a little time talking about how those topics intersect with horror. To be completely honest, there's not a lot to talk about. The 3 things that I have made notes on, first thing that you had talked about was having this safe space with your mom. The second thing was, there have been a few places where you talked about anxiety in a number of different ways. Your physical illness, in some cases, the phrase that you mentioned was inability to escape a situation or feeling trapped.
Yeah.
And also you talked about in your high school years, it was sort of the opposite. It was you were no longer feeling anxious because you had established this group of friends.
Yeah, I agree. We've kind of talked about it.
So, the follow-up question there would be, any idea why that's a topic for you? In general, you could say that's part of my personality, but it's an open-ended question. So if there's something else more specific that you think is relevant, you leave it up to you.
Well, it's interesting. I don't know that the stuff I write truck that much in topics of anxiety. I think maybe some of my characters, particularly in my early books when I was closer in age to my younger years, I think the characters of those books would be more like me. But once you get written 20-some books, I think often start to expand past more and more the kind of person that you are to other type of people. So I don't think I write about characters who are as burdened by anxiety as much as I used to. I think a real exception to that is Whalefall, which in a way is a throwback to some of my first books, in that the main character is a lot like me, and there is a lot of biography in that book that I did kind of on purpose, because I believed that the concept was so strong that I wanted to give it the best support I could, and plumb the most emotional depths that I could. And that meant a sort of return to an earlier age. The anxieties and the feelings of shame and disappointment that I felt more strongly as a teenager, in preteen and teenager. So yeah, I think Whalefall goes into all that.
Well, you said something a second ago that actually ties in with something that as you were talking, I was scrolling up and looking at some of my notes and realized there might be a connection there. And what you had said is that you may have touched on anxiety in some of your earlier books and then moved on to exploring other characters and how other people interact and things like that. And what the note that I had written above was that you were interested in your own fear response.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking that, so maybe not so much anxiety, but exploration of fear response. And as you said, you started with what you knew best, which was your own response, and then maybe started exploring other ways that people respond to fear.
Yeah, I think when you have a certain way you do things that's very embedded in place, if other people do it, react in different ways, it's sort of intrinsically interesting to you. Mm. So I know my fear response as a kid, and I have plumbed that for several books, including Whalefall. But yeah, I think it's probably fair to say I'd have to really think about my other work, but I think it's a decent assumption that that's what I'm doing, is turning away from me and turning towards other types of people and saying, how do they process fears differently?
How do you do it?
I mean, as a kid...
No, I'm saying that you're saying that to them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Saying, how do you do it? How do you navigate a life that is going to be full of fear?
You could have thought of a couple different ways to phrase that. Full of shit is the one that came to mind first.
Yep, that too.
I guess a potential follow-up to that then could be, do you have any idea why fear response is of interest to you?
Well, I think it's just because it overwhelms so much of my attention as a young person. You know, I was just always so afraid and anxious about things that were coming up. Like my diaries are just filled with, in 1 week, I just know this X thing is going to happen, and it's definitely going to happen tomorrow. And then it wouldn't happen, and I just know that it's going to happen the next day. And I was just so preoccupied with gaming out how I was going to get around these anxiety-producing things before they happened.
Well, as I was asking the question, I mean, I think it's very logical that if you're in the bathroom dry heaving, to be asking yourself, why the hell am I doing this?
Yeah.
So then the last question, I guess, really is why horror? And typically in other interviews, that may be a more relevant question because whatever other topics come up in other interviews, you know, sometimes we can say, why don't you explore that in other genres? Uh-huh. I don't know whether or not this is something that you could explore in other genres. I guess it depends on the individual character.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could. I really think you could. And although I'm considered a horror writer, that's really, it is a little bit of a limiting label. You know, like I've written historical fiction, I've written fantasy, sci-fi, written stuff for kids. I wrote a hard case crime novel, so that's crime thriller type thing. So I'm very interested and have been expanding genre as much as I can, if for no other reason than to just keep myself sharp and to not fall into any ruts. And I think you can explore these things in any genre. I think you could write a romance that explored these things.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going when I said depends on the character, because what I was thinking is not just romance, but the two things that came to mind were, if you're writing a war story, then it's a story about a soldier, or, you know, what's his fear response? Is it, what's the situation he's going through, and in a rom-com, maybe you've got, or maybe not even a comedy, but just a drama of, I think I'm going to lose this person that I love very much,
Right.
So it could be, I think, explored in other genres.
Yeah, I agree.
So do you think it's just that you kind of started in horror because, well, do you think that there's a reason that you started in horror, or did you have some other work in some other genre?
My very first book is, I think my very first book, Monster Variations, which was really a Bradbury experiment. I don't know. I've always been really interested in, and maybe this comes from The Invisible Man, maybe that's where that fits in, but I've always been interested really in writing beautifully about grotesque things. That's just been an ongoing fascination. And you can find that all the way up to Whalefall, where I'm writing about whale guts, but hopefully in a way that is unexpectedly sort of moving. So I've always liked that collision, which goes back to Night of the Living Dead, and the bad guys having wise things to say and the good guys making bad choices.
Yeah.
You can take that observation about characters and apply them to what you're writing. Write pretty about other things.
Well, I think we got some interesting stuff for you here. I guess really the only question left that we could ask is if you think there's anything else that's relevant that maybe we haven't thought to ask, or maybe you thought of something earlier in the call and did get a chance to say it because the conversation took a left turn.
I don't think so. I mean, it was again, having just looked at these diaries for the first time ever, this was a good timing for this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we kind of got it.
Okay. Well, we very much appreciate your time.
Of course.
Good conversation.
Yeah, man. I really enjoyed it. It was very different.
Yes.
Than most.
We get that a lot.
Yeah, so I appreciate that a lot.
Yeah. That is part of the goal. Try to do something a little different and make people think.
Yeah, man. It was good. Thank you.
Yeah, a pleasure.
Thank you.
So we're going to get together with you offline. We'll get bio information from you and a couple of pictures that we can use with promotional stuff. And on the bio page, we can link to whatever it is that you want us to link to. So before we hit the closing, you want to, again, let everybody know what you're currently working on?
Yeah, I've got Pay the Piper coming out September this year. And then more or less one novel per year scheduled for the next 4 years. Okay. That's a mix of horror.
What was the one you said that was more of a sci-fi book, but it was rather disturbing?
Yeah, that's the Sixth Nick. That's
Sixth Nick.
NIK, yeah. That comes out 2026.
Oh, okay. So we got some time on that one.
Yes. I have published too many books, so I'm way ahead. Like, these books are all done, but they have to be parceled out over time.
Okay. Well, thank you again for your time, and thank you to anybody out there listening. Please do come visit us at horrormakesushappy.com. We'll have a bio page there for Mr. Kraus, and can link to all his stuff there. We have also got a list of people there that we would like to talk to. If you can get us in touch with any of those, please let us know. Support us in a number of ways that you can find on the website, and if nothing else, please tell a friend. So I'm going to hit stop.